Hello everyone, welcome to Dice Check. My name is Tom, and this is Mark. Today we're going to be talking about Warhammer 40k and the deployment phase. And I guess really the first question we should probably ask ourselves is, what exactly is the deployment phase?
Yes, so the deployment phase is the initial phase of the game. When you start your game and you are setting up all the terrain and objectives, you start placing models, and that is your deployment phase. So in the deployment phase, as you are placing models, there are certain things that you need to look out for or things that need to happen that you probably should know about. Things such as the terrain that's on the field. When you're placing models, maybe it behooves you to place that model behind the terrain that is obscuring, so that way your opponent can't shoot you off the table.
Mm-hmm. And definitely one of the many ways that we figure out what the board is really supposed to look like and what our deployment zones are, is we get them from the various books that Games Workshop has for us.
Yeah, things such as the core rulebook. The core rulebook has a couple different game types: open play, match play, and then there's also other books such as the Grand Tournament book and the Crusade book. Now, all of these have different types of deployment, all different types of objectives.
And they even have, handy diagrams in them. Here we have one of the Eternal War missions. And basically, it shows you on the map itself where the objectives are placed, what the measurements are for them, and where the deployment zones are. They'll have one for each team.
So again, things to look out for in the deployment phase are things such as prioritizing your drops, using the terrain to your advantage, and pre-measuring, and pre-movement and infiltration, things to look out for.
Pre-measuring is definitely one of the essential keys for any deployment.
Right.
You always want to make sure, because knowing your army and knowing what your army is capable of shooting, capable of moving, all of that stuff comes into play because you're basically putting your stuff on the board, ready for you to initiate your attack.
Yep, that's right.
Or defense, even.
Yeah, definitely. One thing I always kind of like is deploying as if you are going to go second.
Always.
Deploying safely. I wouldn't say always, but I think most of the time. There's definitely times where you want to be like in forward movement, depending on the tactics of your army and what you play and whatnot.
I'm a big fan of that because basically once the deployment zones are created and we determine who's going to be deploying first, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be going first.
That's right.
So that's why it's kind of, it is a game of, chance using the dice roll to determine who goes first.
Right.
That's why it's always kind of smart to plan on going second.
Right, and prioritizing your drops.
Exactly.
You're looking for your opponent to give you an opening. So as you're dropping, units of your army, you're placing units behind terrain, your opponent's placing units behind terrain, but sometimes you don't have that luxury. Sometimes you can't place a whole unit behind obscuring terrain, and there's just a little bit maybe peeking out, and that little bit peeking out you can get caught.
Yeah, it's very, it's what we call deploying conservatively. When you have, planning on going second, or, maybe even hoping to go first, but more than likely going second, you usually are deploying conservatively, which, you're basically planning for them to go first and for them to make the first initial attacks towards you.
Right.
So you want to hide as much as you can. And unfortunately, yeah, you're right. Sometimes you can't.
Right. Things such as like the objective placement and whatnot is going to determine where you're placing models. Sometimes the terrain's too far back and you can't get that unit on an objective for a hold more or hold two mission. So yeah, in the deployment phase, when you start placing your models, you're usually looking for your opponent to give you an opening. So when you're placing models, you're placing it behind obscuring terrain, you're placing it close enough so you can jump on an objective, things of that nature.
And one of the things to remember too is that during the deployment, you are deploying one unit at a time and passing it back and forth.
Right.
So your opponent and you. Your opponent and you.
Yeah.
Or the other way around.
Things like that are why you're using the terrain to your advantage.
Exactly.
Why you're using pre-measuring, so that way you can possibly outrange your opponent or jump out of your opponent's threat range.
That's why it's also good to know who your opponent is.
Right.
You also want to keep in mind his threat range and what are his big units, because that's the key, is knowing, as they always say, like, you want to know your enemy.
Yeah.
And during deployment phase, that's the key point of the game, is because if he's placing down a short range unit, you know that, okay, these guys are safe on this side. I can
go jump on an objective or something of that nature.
You can counter.
And don't be afraid to ask your opponent, oh, what's the range on a Riptide's burst cannon?
Yeah, exactly.
Maybe you can be outside of that and still be on the objective during deployment.
Absolutely.
So yeah, other things things to look out for are like pre-movement or infiltration in the deployment phase.
That's correct.
Things like stealth suits or infiltrators, they can actually be in the middle, like in the dead man zone of the deployment.
Yeah, because basically one of the nice ways of doing a deployment and marking out your deployment zone is just taking dice and laying it out as like, okay, this is the deployment zone here, this is the deployment zone here. Right. We've done kind of a mock-up of that right here, and basically you'll have an infiltration unit. They can go past your deployment zone up to whatever it specifies on the rules of that specific.
Right, and maybe they can jump on an objective and still be behind obscuring terrain and be safe.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Those are key things. And also, too, we're not going to go too much into it, but placing units in reserve.
Right.
Placing units in reserve or deep strike abilities, they can come in later in the game. So, you can keep them off the table.
Yeah, using like screening and whatnot.
Exactly,
That's more in the movement phase. And as you're placing units, you're usually looking for your opponent to give you an opening, and your opponent's doing the same thing. So sometimes maybe you want to either bait your opponent by placing a nice big unit out there and giving them something like, oh, maybe I need to put more units on this side to focus that side down, or maybe I need to deploy on the other side of my board, and that's what your opponent wants you to do, so that way he can place all his big stuff on that side, like 3 Riptides, for example. Maybe you want your 2 Riptides on one side versus the other side.
Usually, taking the Riptide, for instance, right? One of its abilities is it can overcharge its reactor, meaning that it can give himself like a 3-up invulnerable save. If you're not playing turn 1, you can't get that off.
Right.
You can't. So it's really good if you're planning to deploy conservatively, right? You want to hide that Riptide. So being, an obscuring piece of terrain like we have here, placing a Riptide behind that building, making sure his base is hidden behind the profile of this building.
He is now safe.
He's now safe because he cannot target me unless he has a weapon that ignores line of sight.
Yeah, a lot of the time, I wouldn't say 100% of the time, it's good to deploy as if you think you're going to go second. So that way, the first turn, second turn disparity isn't big. 8th was very, very alpha striking. 9th is now more objective based.
Yeah.
So you wanna have your units able to jump on an objective. You wanna have your units
ready to go.
Yeah. You wanna have them survive.
Yeah. In some cases, if you are trying basically going all out for turn 1 and you want to try to plan for turn 1, those are times when taking something and you want to play as aggressively as humanly possible. You're going to place them right out on your front line. And
that's a good way to get shot off.
Exactly. Yeah. That's why we always say, it's a good process to plan to go second, because if he's just sitting out here, and there's nothing else for him to really shoot at.
Right, you're giving him one big juicy target, and your opponent's like, okay, well, I'm going to put all my big stuff right here, and even if I go first or second, all I need to do is push my unit up and touch this building, and now I can shoot his unit that's way out in the open.
Yeah, exactly. Those are definitely things that can be done.
Yes.
One little trick, on some of these things, especially with obscuring terrain, is for certain things that have special rules, such as a savior protocol or something like that.
Or a lookout sir.
Or a lookout sir. Yeah. You want to place a unit and you want him to be that primary target, but you also want him to have some guys behind him. So if you could place a unit here and keep another unit
within
hidden,
that savior, that
pseudo
savior
protocol.
Yeah,
exactly. Within that range, they can't be targeted.
Right.
So he can shoot at this thing all day long.
And you can savior all day.
Exactly.
Yeah, little tips and tricks of things to look out for in the deployment phase.
Yeah, absolutely.
Another big thing is big models, such as this beautiful Mortarion right here. He can be targeted no matter what the terrain is, whether it's obscuring or not. He can always be seen just like flyers or aircraft.
Yeah, or even Imperial Knights.
Right. Yeah, that's right. They can always be seen. They can always be shot. So no matter how well you hide them, they can still get shot. With true line of sight.
Exactly. Yeah, true line of sight is really one of the key words in a lot of this stuff, and that's kind of that's why we one of the reasons we play 40k is we really like to build the terrain. We like having this dynamic scenery. It does play a role in your game because if something doesn't have any windows and it's a big terrain, you can't see through it.
That's right.
If it's got windows, yeah, you can. But that's kind of one of those things. It's, no matter what, as long as they have true line of sight, which is what we call that, is when they can physically, from their model to your model, see it.
Yeah. So just to reiterate, in your deployment phase, look out for pre-movement. Look out for infiltration. prioritizing your drops, looking for an opening or looking for your opponent to give you an opening or vice versa, using the terrain to your advantage, being able to deploy a little defensively so that way you're not shot off turn 1.
Yeah,
and
even deploying a little sneaky and baiting them to come after a target
That's right.
of yours.
That's right. And to take a look at the core rule book and the Grand Tournament and the Crusade book, and take a look at the deployment phases. Maybe come up with some different strategies for yourself. There's that WTC terrain packet that can also help you. It gives you all the different terrain setups and
terrain
whatnot.
setups
So
and how to actually build
you can
the
even
board.
pre-plan on some of these things.
Yeah,
There's
absolutely.
also the ITC Battle app that gives you all the pre-game setup. It gives you a picture of the deployment phases and how to set up different objectives and whatnot.
We use that a lot.
Pretty handy.
We use that a lot here on Dice Check is in building our terrain and making sure that it's fair. There's also another way when you're deploying too. You can always make up your own.
That's right, yeah.
There's a lot of games that Mark and I play where
Hey, this looks cool.
yeah, exactly. We build these huge giant trench lines just because we think they look cool.
Right.
And really that's kind of the thing is you can do different types of deployment ways. It sky's the limit.
Right.
As
These
far
are just
as what,
things to look out
Yeah,
for.
these are just ways that it makes it easier for you guys being new players or being interested in the hobby, trying to get into this. It's all right here for you.
Right.
Everything that we talk about and we do on Dice Check and during our games, you can find them in the books.
That's right.
Well, that's it for Dice Check, talking about the deployment phase in Warhammer 40k. We just want to thank you guys for tuning in. If you liked what you see, don't be afraid to hit that like button, subscribe, and follow us for any of the new videos we're going to be coming out with. I'm Tom the Beast. This is Marky Mark from Dice Check. Thank you.